I thought this was just another rich family story. Until this happened. A woman in a pink dress stood on the steps of a mansion, pointing her finger at another woman's face, screaming words that would follow her for the rest of her life. The maid didn't fight back. She didn't run. She just stood there, tears falling silently, while dozens of wealthy guests laughed and pointed like she was nothing more than entertainment for their evening. Nobody in that crowd knew what was about to happen next. Nobody knew that in less than 10 minutes, the entire mansion would go silent, and the woman doing all the pointing would be the one begging for mercy. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told on this channel. It's about pride, cruelty, and the quiet strength of a woman nobody thought was worth respecting. Stay with me until the end, because what happens in this story will completely change how you look at the people society tells us to overlook. The morning air in Greenwich, Connecticut always smelled like cut grass and money. Grace Whitfield had worked at the Sinclair estate for 9 years. 9 years of waking up before the sun, 9 years of ironing shirts that cost more than her monthly rent, 9 years of quietly holding a household together while the man who owned it barely noticed her name. That man was Nathan Sinclair. 34 years old, CEO of Sinclair Dynamics, a real estate and technology empire his father had built, and he had doubled in size within 6 years of taking over. Nathan wasn't cruel. He wasn't even cold, not really. He was simply distracted, the way powerful men often are, consumed by boardrooms and mergers and a world that moved too fast for him to notice the woman who kept his home running like clockwork. Grace didn't mind the distance. In fact, she preferred it. Being invisible had its advantages. Nobody asked questions about the framed photo she kept hidden in her bedside drawer. A photo of a man in an army uniform, smiling the way only someone deeply in love could smile. Nobody asked why she flinched slightly whenever anyone mentioned hospital bills. Nobody asked how a single mother managed to raise a bright, curious 10-year-old boy named Caleb on a housekeeper's salary in one of the most expensive counties in America. The one person in that house who did notice Grace, really noticed her, was 6-year-old Lily Sinclair. Lily had lost her mother to illness when she was only 2. She barely remembered her. What she remembered, what she clung to, was Grace. Grace, who braided her hair every morning before school. Grace, who stayed up late helping her practice spelling words. Grace, who never once made her feel like a burden, even on the nights Nathan came home too late to tuck her in. "Miss Grace," Lily said one morning, swinging her small legs from the kitchen stool, "Daddy said someone new is coming to live with us." Grace kept her eyes on the pan of scrambled eggs, careful to keep her voice light. "Is that so? Her name is Vanessa. Daddy says we're getting married." Grace's hand paused for just a moment over the stove before she smiled and set a plate in front of the little girl. "Well then, we'll have to make sure the house looks its very best for her, won't we?" Lily didn't answer right away. She just studied Grace's face the way children do when they sense something adults try to hide. Nathan had met Vanessa Cole 8 months earlier at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was 30 years old, stunning, sharp-tongued in a way that people in his circle mistook for confidence, and connected to some of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. Their courtship had moved fast. Dinners at rooftop restaurants, weekend trips to the Hamptons, a proposal on a yacht that made the society pages. Nathan told himself he was happy. He told himself Vanessa would be good for Lily, good for the image of the Sinclair name, good for a life that had felt hollow since his wife passed. He hadn't yet learned what kind of woman Vanessa really was behind closed doors. Grace found out within the first hour of meeting her. Vanessa arrived at the estate in a black car, 3 suitcases trailing behind her, and barely glanced at Grace as she stepped through the front door. "You must be the help," she said, handing Grace her coat without waiting for a response. "I expect my rooms to be spotless. And I mean spotless. I don't do dust." "Of course, ma'am," Grace said, folding the coat carefully over her arm. Vanessa's eyes flicked over her. The modest uniform, the tired lines beneath kind eyes, the quiet dignity Grace carried like armor. Something about it seemed to irritate her immediately, though Grace couldn't have said why. "What's your name?" Vanessa asked, not out of curiosity but the way someone asks for a label. "Grace, ma'am." "Grace," Vanessa repeated, testing the word like it amused her. "Cute. Try not to hover, Grace. I don't like being watched while I unpack." Grace nodded and turned to leave, and it was only when she reached the hallway that she allowed herself a breath. She had dealt with difficult employers before. She could deal with this one too. She had survived worse than cold words from a woman who mistook cruelty for elegance. What Grace didn't know yet was that Vanessa Cole didn't simply dislike her. Vanessa saw something in Grace that unsettled her, a quiet strength she couldn't buy, couldn't fake, and couldn't stand being around. And in 6 weeks, at the engagement party that would introduce Vanessa to the entire Sinclair social circle, that unease would curdle into something far more dangerous. The weeks that followed tested every ounce of patience Grace had built over 9 years of service. Vanessa complained about the temperature of her tea, the thread count of her sheets, the way Grace folded towels. "Hotel style, not amateur style," she'd snapped one afternoon, throwing a perfectly pressed towel back into the laundry basket. She criticized the meals the household chef prepared, insisted the flower arrangements in the foyer be replaced twice a week, and treated every staff member like furniture that occasionally needed correcting. But it was her treatment of Lily that worried Grace most. "She doesn't need to be underfoot every time I'm in a room," Vanessa told Nathan one evening, unaware Grace was folding laundry in the hallway just outside the study. "I'm not her mother, Nathan. I'm not going to pretend to be. She's 6, Vanessa. She just wants." "She has Grace for that," Vanessa cut in. "That's literally what we pay her for." Grace's hands stilled over the shirt she was folding. She told herself not to feel the sting of it. She told herself this wasn't her business, that Nathan's relationship with his fiancée wasn't hers to judge. But that night, when Lily crawled into her lap during story time and whispered, "Miss Grace, does Daddy still love me even though he's getting married?" Something in Grace's chest cracked just slightly. "Your daddy loves you more than anything in this world," Grace whispered back, smoothing the little girl's hair. "That will never change. Not ever." She meant it. And in the weeks that followed, she made sure of it, quietly filling the gaps Vanessa left behind, making sure Lily never felt the absence of warmth in her own home. Nathan noticed none of this. He was buried in a merger that consumed 16 hours of his day, and when he did surface, it was Vanessa's voice he heard, Vanessa's plans he approved, Vanessa's vision for their engagement party he signed off on without a second thought. 200 guests. The Sinclair estate transformed into something out of a magazine. String quartet. Sculptures. A guest list that read like a who's who of East Coast wealth. "It needs to be perfect," Vanessa told the event planner, glancing pointedly at Grace across the room. "Every detail. I won't have anything embarrassing me in front of people who matter." Grace kept her head down and kept working. She organized the staff schedule for the party, oversaw the setup of the tents on the back lawn, made sure every member of the household knew their role for the evening. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't expect any. What she didn't know was that Vanessa had begun watching her more closely than anyone realized. Not out of respect, but out of something colder. Vanessa had noticed the way guests who'd visited the estate before sometimes greeted Grace warmly, the way Lily gravitated toward her instead of her own soon-to-be stepmother, the way Nathan, in rare unguarded moments, would thank Grace with a genuine smile he rarely gave anyone else. It planted a seed of resentment in Vanessa that grew uglier by the day. 3 nights before the party, Vanessa's mother's antique diamond necklace, a piece worth well over $200,000, meant to be worn at the engagement celebration, went missing from the guest suite. Vanessa tore the room apart, screaming for the staff to be questioned. Nathan, exhausted and eager to keep the peace, promised her the matter would be handled. Security footage was reviewed. Nothing conclusive turned up. The camera in that wing had malfunctioned days earlier and hadn't yet been repaired. Vanessa didn't need footage. She had already decided who to blame. "It's her," she told Nathan flatly, arms crossed. "The maid. Grace. She's the only one who has access to every room in this house. I want her gone before the party." "Vanessa, we don't have any proof." "I don't need proof, Nathan. I need my necklace, and I need that woman out of my sight." Nathan hesitated. Some part of him, some quiet, buried instinct, told him this didn't sit right. Grace had been with his family for 9 years. She'd cared for Lily like she was her own. She had never once given him a reason to doubt her. But he was tired, and the wedding was close, and Vanessa's voice was sharp enough to cut through his exhaustion like a blade. "Fine," he said finally, hating himself even as the word left his mouth. "We'll deal with it after the party." Quietly, Vanessa smiled, satisfied. She had no intention of waiting that long. She had something far more public in mind, and it would happen in front of every single guest at the engagement party, 2 nights from now. The night of the engagement party arrived wrapped in golden light and quiet music. The Sinclair estate had never looked more beautiful. White orchids lined the marble staircase, string lights wound through the ancient oak trees on the back lawn, and 200 of the wealthiest, most influential people on the East Coast mingled beneath a sky just beginning to darken into evening. Grace moved through the chaos of the final preparations with practiced calm, checking on the catering staff, making sure the champagne towers were steady, making sure Lily, dressed in a small lavender gown, hair braided with tiny white flowers, had eaten dinner before the guests arrived. "You look beautiful," Grace told her, kneeling to straighten the little girl's dress. "You look beautiful too, Miss Grace," Lily said seriously, and Grace laughed softly, brushing a kiss against her forehead. She had no idea that within the hour, this would be the last gentle moment of the evening. Vanessa descended the staircase just after 7, radiant in a custom pink gown, diamonds at her ears, every hair in place. She smiled for photographers, laughed at the right moments, played the role of adoring fiancée with practiced perfection. But beneath the smile, something sharp was building. Guests had begun arriving in waves, champagne flowed freely, and as the evening deepened, Vanessa found herself scanning the crowd for the one person she'd already decided would pay for her missing necklace. She found Grace near the dessert table, quietly refilling a tray of pastries. "There you are," Vanessa said, loud enough for the guests nearby to turn. Grace straightened immediately. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "No," Vanessa said, voice rising. "Everything is not all right. My mother's necklace, the one my grandmother wore at her own wedding, has been missing for 3 days. And you're the only person in this house with access to every single room." A ripple of attention moved through the crowd. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. "Ma'am, I promise you I haven't seen." "Don't lie to me." Vanessa's voice cracked through the evening air like a whip. She stepped closer, finger raised, jabbing toward Grace's chest. "You think because you've been here 9 years, you're untouchable? You think because Nathan's daughter likes you, you can steal from this family and get away with it?" "I would never steal anything," Grace said, her voice trembling now, tears rising despite every effort to hold them back. "Please, ma'am, I've worked for this family for 9 years, I would never." "Search her," Vanessa shouted, and the word landed like a gunshot across the lawn. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier now turned fully toward the scene, drinks forgotten in their hands. Some pulled out their phones. Some began to laugh, the ugly, careless laugh of people who had never once feared losing everything they had. A few pointed, murmuring to each other, treating Grace's humiliation like theater. You people, Vanessa spat, gesturing at the household staff who had gathered nervously near the tents. You're all the same. You take and you take and you think no one notices. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming freely down her face now, humiliation burning through every inch of her body. She thought of Caleb at home with a neighbor who watched him some evenings, thought of 9 years of loyalty, thought of every towel folded and every meal prepared and every night she'd stayed late so Nathan wouldn't come home to an empty house. None of it seemed to matter in this moment. Please, she whispered. I didn't take anything. Then empty your pockets, Vanessa screamed, and the entire lawn fell into stunned silence, waiting. It was in that silence, that terrible, suffocating silence, that a small voice cut through the crowd. Miss Grace didn't take it. Every head turned. Lily Sinclair stood at the edge of the crowd in her lavender dress, small hands clenched at her sides, chin trembling but her voice steady. I saw Vanessa hide it. In her closet. Behind her shoes. I saw her do it 2 nights ago, and I didn't understand why until now. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grace had ever heard in her life. For a moment nobody moved. Vanessa's face went through a series of rapid changes. Shock, then a brittle, forced laugh. She's 6 years old, Vanessa said, turning to the crowd with a strained smile. Children make things up. She probably misunderstood something or... I'm not lying. Lily's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. She walked forward past the stunned guests, until she stood between Grace and Vanessa. I saw you put a shiny necklace in a shoebox in your closet. I thought it was a present for someone. I didn't know it was bad until you started yelling at Miss Grace. Nathan, who had been across the lawn shaking hands with a business partner, pushed through the crowd at the sound of raised voices, arriving just in time to hear his daughter's words hang in the air. What is going on? He demanded, looking between Vanessa's pale face and Grace's tear-streaked one. Nathan, your daughter is confused. She doesn't understand what she... I know what a closet looks like, Lily said fiercely, and despite the tension, a few guests couldn't help the small, surprised laugh that escaped them. And I know it was in her closet. Behind the red shoes. Nathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Vanessa for a long moment, really looked at her, the way he hadn't in months, seeing past the beautiful dress and the polished smile to something colder underneath. Go check, he said quietly to the head of security standing nearby. Now. Nathan, this is absurd. You're going to take the word of a 6-year-old over. She's never lied to me in her life, Nathan said, his voice low and dangerous. Not once. Can you say the same? The security guard returned 4 minutes later. 4 minutes that felt like an hour. 4 minutes in which Vanessa's composure cracked visibly with every passing second. 4 minutes in which Grace stood trembling, one hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder. He held a small velvet box. He opened it in front of everyone. The diamond necklace glittered under the string lights, exactly where Lily said it would be. The lawn erupted into stunned murmurs. Phones that had been recording Grace's humiliation moments earlier now turned toward Vanessa, capturing the color draining from her face, the desperate way she reached for Nathan's arm. Nathan, I can explain. Explain what? His voice was quiet now, quieter than before, and somehow that made it more devastating than shouting could have. Explain why you hid your own necklace. Explain why you humiliated a woman who has cared for my daughter, cared for this family for 9 years, in front of 200 people, over something you did yourself. I wanted. Vanessa's voice broke. I wanted her gone. I wanted her out of this house. She's always in the way, always making Lily prefer her over me, always making you look at her like she matters more than. She stopped herself too late. The words had already left her mouth, already confirmed everything Nathan needed to know. You planned this, he said slowly, the realization settling over him like ice water. You planted the necklace so you could accuse her publicly. You wanted to humiliate her in front of everyone I know. Vanessa said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Nathan turned to Grace, who stood pale and shaking, Lily still pressed against her side. Something in his chest twisted painfully at the sight of her. The woman who had quietly held his household, his daughter, and apparently his own blindness together for 9 years, standing there humiliated because of his own failure to see clearly. "Grace," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "I am so sorry. I should have trusted you. I should have never let this happen." Grace couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears still falling, one hand pressed to her mouth. Vanessa's engagement ring came off before the guests had even finished processing what they'd witnessed. Nathan didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply asked security to escort Vanessa Cole off the property, effective immediately, and the 200 guests who had gathered to celebrate a union now watched it dissolve in real time, whispers rippling across the lawn like wildfire. But for Grace, the humiliation of the evening hadn't fully lifted yet. Even with the truth exposed, even with Vanessa gone, she still felt the weight of 200 strangers' eyes, the memory of laughter, the memory of a finger pointed at her chest like she was something to be discarded. She didn't know yet that this night, the worst night of her employment in this house, was about to become the beginning of something she never could have imagined. The party didn't end that night. If anything, it transformed. As word of what happened spread across the lawn, the mood shifted from stunned silence to something quieter and more thoughtful. Guests who had laughed and pointed minutes earlier now avoided Grace's eyes, shame creeping into expressions that had been careless just moments before. A few approached her directly, murmuring apologies she barely had the strength to acknowledge. Nathan sent the remaining guests home early, citing a family matter, and the estate slowly emptied until it was just the household staff, Lily, and Grace remaining in the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. He found Grace in the kitchen an hour later, sitting at the small staff table where she usually ate her meals alone, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Lily was curled asleep in a chair beside her, exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening, one small hand still resting on Grace's arm even in sleep. Nathan stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "May I sit?" Grace looked up, startled. In 9 years, Nathan Sinclair had never once sat at the staff table. "Of course, sir." "Nathan," he corrected gently, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "Please. After tonight, I think we're past, sir." Grace didn't respond right away. The events of the evening still sat heavy in her chest. The pointed finger, the demand to empty her pockets, the laughter of strangers who had decided her guilt before she'd even had the chance to speak. "I need you to know," Nathan said carefully, "that what happened tonight was inexcusable. Not just what Vanessa did, though that was monstrous, but my own failure to trust you. 9 years, Grace. 9 years you've taken care of this house, taken care of my daughter, and the moment someone raised a finger against you, I hesitated. I let it happen for 2 full days before it exploded in front of everyone I know. That's on me." Grace's eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't humiliation behind the tears. "I appreciate you saying that. You do. But Sir Nathan, I understand how this works. People like Vanessa, people with her kind of money, their word carries weight that mine never will. I've made peace with that a long time ago." "You shouldn't have to make peace with that," Nathan said, and something fierce entered his voice. "Not in my house. Not while I'm the one running it." He glanced at his sleeping daughter, still curled against Grace's side, and something in his expression softened into something closer to wonder. "She stood up for you in front of 200 people," he said quietly. 6 years old, and she had more courage tonight than most adults I know. "She has a good heart," Grace whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "She's always had one." "She has it because of you," Nathan said. I know I haven't been the most present father these past few years. Work consumed me after Claire died, and somewhere in there I stopped noticing the things that mattered most. But I've noticed tonight. I've noticed that my daughter's kindness, her honesty, her courage, all of it came from watching you. Not from me. From you. Grace didn't know how to respond to that. 9 years of quiet, invisible labor, and in a single devastating night, she'd been seen, truly seen, for the first time. What will happen now? She asked softly. With the household. With everything. Vanessa's engagement is over, obviously. She won't be coming back. Nathan's jaw tightened briefly before relaxing. As for the household, I want to make things right. Not just apologize and move on, but actually make things right. I should have been paying closer attention to how this family runs, to what you've been carrying on your own for years. Grace shook her head slightly. You don't owe me anything beyond what you already pay me, Nathan. I do my job because I care about this family. Not for reward. I know that, Nathan said. That's exactly why you deserve one. He didn't elaborate further that night. But something had shifted in the Sinclair household. A quiet recalibration, a debt acknowledged even if not yet repaid. Grace carried Lily up to bed that night, tucking her into her small canopy bed the way she had 1,000 times before, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry. Not from humiliation, but from something like relief. She had no idea that the coming weeks would reveal just how much Nathan Sinclair meant what he said. The days following the party were strange in a way Grace hadn't expected. News of what happened had spread quickly through Greenwich's tight social circles. Not through malice this time, but through a kind of collective reckoning. Several guests who had laughed that night sent private apologies. One woman, the wife of a hedge fund manager, showed up at the estate personally to apologize to Grace's face, admitting shame at how easily she'd joined in mocking someone she'd never even bothered to learn the name of. Vanessa, for her part, disappeared from Nathan's life entirely. Word eventually reached the estate that she'd left the state altogether, her reputation among the East Coast elite in ruins. Not because of what she'd done to a member of the household staff, many in that world might have overlooked that easily enough, but because she'd been caught doing it so transparently, so publicly, in front of exactly the kind of people whose opinions she'd built her entire identity around. Grace tried to return to her normal routine, but something in the house had fundamentally shifted. Nathan, who had spent 9 years moving through his own home like a ghost distracted by empire building, began coming home earlier. He started eating dinner with Lily most nights instead of working through the meal in his study. And more than once, Grace caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place, something between gratitude and quiet reassessment. One Tuesday evening, he asked her to sit with him in the study after Lily had gone to bed. I looked into some things, he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. About Caleb's school. Grace's stomach tightened. She hadn't spoken much about her son to Nathan over the years. A few mentions here and there, careful never to burden her employer with the details of her personal life. I don't understand. He's 10, correct? Bright kid, from what little you've told me. I did some digging. I hope that doesn't feel invasive, and it looks like he's been testing well above grade level in math and science. He works hard, Grace said carefully, still unsure where this was heading. I want to help get him into Brightwater Academy, Nathan said. It's one of the best schools in the state. I've already spoken to the admissions director. There's a full scholarship available, and I'd like to make sure Caleb has a spot secured for the fall term. Grace stared at him, momentarily speechless. Brightwater Academy was a name she recognized only from a distance, a school she'd never dared imagine for her son, tuition alone exceeding what she made in an entire year. Nathan, I can't accept something like that. It's too much. It's not charity, Nathan said firmly. And it's not about tonight or the party or guilt, though I'll admit some of that is there too. It's about recognizing what I should have recognized years ago, that you've given this family everything, and I've given almost nothing back. Caleb deserves opportunities. You've clearly raised him to deserve them. Grace's hands trembled slightly around the folder. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Nathan said, a small, genuine smile crossing his face for what felt like the first time in months. That's all you have to say. Over the following weeks, more changes came. Nathan increased Grace's salary substantially, formalized her role within the household with a title and benefits that reflected the responsibility she'd carried quietly for nearly a decade, and, perhaps most meaningfully to Grace, began insisting she join the family for dinner some evenings, rather than eating separately in the kitchen as she always had. Lily, thrilled by the new arrangement, began referring to Grace less as Miss Grace, the housekeeper, and more simply as Miss Grace. The distinction subtle but significant to a 6-year-old's understanding of family. Caleb, when Grace finally told him about Brightwater, had cried, quiet, disbelieving tears. The kind of tears a 10-year-old cries when a door he never knew existed suddenly swings open in front of him. Mom, he'd said, wiping his eyes. Does this mean things are going to be different now? Grace had pulled him close, thinking of the photograph in her bedside drawer. Thinking of the promise she'd made years ago to a man who never got to see his son grow up. I think it means we're finally being seen, baby. That's all. We're finally being seen. She didn't yet know how much more was still to come. Autumn arrived in Greenwich the way it always did. Golden and slow, the estate's ancient oaks turning brilliant shades of amber and red. Caleb started at Brightwater Academy in September, nervous but determined. And within his first month, his teachers were already remarking on how quickly he'd adjusted, how naturally curious and hardworking he was. Grace watched her son walk through the school's ornate front doors on his first day, dressed in a crisp new uniform Nathan had insisted on covering in full, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope, unguarded and full. Back at the estate, the household had settled into a new rhythm. Nathan had hired additional staff to help manage the property, easing the workload Grace had carried largely alone for so long. He'd also begun, quietly and without fanfare, attending Lily's school events himself rather than sending Grace in his place, something that had happened more often than either of them liked to admit in years past. I keep thinking about that night, Nathan admitted to Grace one evening in October, the two of them sitting on the back porch while Lily played nearby with the family's golden retriever. About how close I came to letting it happen. If Lily hadn't spoken up. But she did, Grace said gently. Children see things clearly sometimes. More clearly than adults, I think. She knew what was right, and she said it, consequences be damned. She gets that from you, Nathan said again, the way he had that first night. I've been thinking about that a lot too. About what kind of example I want to set for her going forward. I don't want her growing up thinking wealth excuses cruelty. I don't want her thinking people like Vanessa are the standard for how to treat others. She won't, Grace said with quiet certainty. Not with you paying attention now. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter chase the dog across the lawn, laughing freely in a way that seemed to ease something tight in his chest. I've made a lot of mistakes since Claire died. I threw myself into work because it was easier than feeling anything else. I told myself Lily was fine because you were there, because the house ran smoothly, because on paper everything looked fine. I never stopped to consider what it cost you to hold all of that together while I disappeared into spreadsheets and boardrooms. You're here now, Grace said simply. That matters more than the years you weren't. It was around this time that the story of what had happened at the engagement party, despite the family's efforts to keep it private, began circulating more widely, aided by the handful of guests who had recorded portions of the incident on their phones. A local news outlet picked up a heavily edited version of events, framing it as a story about class, dignity, and the quiet heroism of an overlooked housekeeper and a 6-year-old girl brave enough to tell the truth. Grace hated the attention at first. She'd spent 9 years perfecting invisibility, and suddenly she was fielding questions from reporters outside the estate gates. her photo appearing in articles she never asked to be part of. But something unexpected came from the exposure. Women who worked in domestic service across the country reached out to her, through letters, through social media, through the local news station that eventually interviewed her directly, sharing their own stories of being dismissed, disrespected, and disbelieved by the families they served. Grace found herself, almost accidentally, becoming a voice for people who rarely had one. "I never wanted to be some kind of symbol," she told Nathan one night, overwhelmed by the volume of messages she'd received. "I just wanted to do my job and raise my son." Sometimes, Nathan said, the people who never wanted to be symbols are exactly the ones who become the most important ones. You didn't ask for any of this, Grace. But look what it's done. Look how many people are seeing themselves in your story. Grace thought about that for a long time after he left the room. She thought about the photograph in her drawer, about the man who'd once told her that quiet strength was still strength, that dignity didn't require an audience to be real. She thought he would have been proud of how far she'd come, even through circumstances neither of them could have predicted. She had no idea that the most meaningful change of all was still waiting just around the corner. Winter settled over the Sinclair estate slowly, the oak trees stripped bare, snow dusting the long driveway that Grace had walked 1,000 times over 9 years. Caleb had finished his first semester at Brightwater with honors, his confidence blooming in ways Grace had only dreamed of for him. Lily had grown closer to Grace than ever, the two of them baking cookies together most weekends, Grace teaching her patiently the same recipes her own mother had once taught her. And Nathan had changed in ways that surprised even himself. He'd restructured parts of his company that winter, implementing new policies around how Sinclair Dynamics treated its own support staff, janitorial workers, security guards, administrative assistants who had long been overlooked in a culture that celebrated executives while ignoring everyone who made their success possible. He credited the shift, publicly and without embarrassment, to a lesson his own household had taught him. "I used to think leadership meant being at the top of every room," he told a business journalist during an interview that winter, one Grace happened to read over coffee one morning. "I've learned it actually means noticing the people holding the room together, especially when they're not asking to be noticed." Grace set the newspaper down that morning with a small, private smile, thinking of how far the events of that terrible night had traveled, how much good had grown from something so painful. It was in early December that Nathan asked her to sit with him again, this time not in the study but in the estate's small library, a fire crackling in the hearth, snow falling steadily outside the tall windows. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "and I want to run it by you honestly, without any pressure attached." "Of course. The household manager position, the one I created for you after everything happened, I think you've outgrown it. You run this estate better than anyone I've ever employed, Grace. You handle logistics, staff, budgets, all of it with more competence than most executives I work with. I'd like to offer you a position overseeing operations across all of our family properties. It would mean a substantial change. New title, new salary, new responsibilities. And obviously, it would mean Caleb continuing at Brightwater with full support, for as long as he wants to stay." Grace sat in stunned silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them. "Nathan, I don't have a background in property management. I don't have the kind of education that role would typically require. You've been managing one of the most complex households on the East Coast for 9 years without a single formal complaint, without a single failure, all while raising a remarkable son on your own and somehow still finding the emotional energy to be the most stable, loving presence in my daughter's life. I don't think a degree is going to teach you anything you don't already know how to do." Grace felt tears rising again, though these were different from the ones she'd cried in September. Lighter somehow, easier to carry. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You keep saying that," Nathan said, a warm smile crossing his face. "And I keep telling you, just say yes." He said yes. The following weeks brought a flurry of changes: a formal contract, a significant salary increase, a small but meaningful office in the estate's east wing that had once been used for storage. Grace approached the new role with the same quiet diligence she'd brought to everything else, and within months, the properties under her management ran more smoothly than they ever had. But the real change wasn't in her title or her paycheck. It was in the way she walked through the world now, not as someone waiting to be overlooked, but as someone who had finally, fully been seen. Late one evening in January, Lily crawled into Grace's lap during story time, the way she had 1,000 times before, and looked up at her with the serious, searching eyes only children seem to possess. "Miss Grace," she said quietly, "are you happy now?" Grace pressed a kiss to the top of her head, thinking of everything that had led to this moment: the humiliation, the fear, the quiet years of invisibility, and the courage of a 6-year-old girl who had refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. "I am," she said softly. "I really am." Spring came early that year, the estate's gardens bursting into bloom weeks ahead of schedule, as if even the earth itself sensed something had shifted for the better in that house. Grace's new role had settled into a steady rhythm by then, and with it came a kind of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Not arrogance, never that, but a quiet certainty in her own worth that no amount of humiliation could ever again shake loose. Caleb, now approaching the end of his first full year at Brightwater, had discovered a passion for robotics, spending weekends building small mechanical projects in the estate's garage with an intensity that reminded Grace achingly of his father. She kept the photograph in her drawer still, but she found herself talking about him more openly now. To Nathan, to Lily, even to Caleb himself, sharing stories of the man who had given his life in service, the man whose quiet strength Grace had carried forward through every difficult year since. "He would be proud of you," Nathan told her one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch as the sun set behind the tree line. "Both of you. Caleb and you." "I think about that a lot," Grace admitted. "Whether I've done right by him. Whether I've raised Caleb the way he would have wanted." "You have," Nathan said without hesitation. "I've watched you with that boy. I've watched the way you've built a life for him out of almost nothing. That's not luck, Grace. That's strength. That's the kind of strength most people never have to test." Their friendship, because that's what it had become, something Grace still found herself surprised by some mornings, had deepened over the winter into something neither of them had quite named yet, though both privately wondered about it. Nathan found himself looking forward to their evening conversations more than he cared to admit. Grace found herself, for the first time in years, allowing herself to imagine a future that included something beyond simply surviving. Neither of them rushed it. Both had been burned before. Nathan by a fiancée who'd revealed her true nature too late, Grace by loss that had taught her caution above all else. But something steady had grown between them over the months since that terrible night at the engagement party, something built not on grand gestures but on small, consistent acts of care. Nathan remembering the small details of Grace's life, asking after Caleb's robotics projects with genuine interest, sitting with her in comfortable silence after long days. It was Lily, in the end, who said what neither adult had quite worked up the courage to voice. "You two like each other," she announced one evening at dinner, with all the blunt confidence of a 7-year-old who had recently had a birthday and felt entitled to speak her mind freely. "Everyone can tell. Even Caleb thinks so." Nathan nearly choked on his water. Grace felt her face flush warm. "Lily," Grace said, laughing despite herself, "that's not really something to." "I just think it would be nice," Lily continued undeterred, "if you were here all the time. Not just for work. For real." The table fell into a soft, charged silence, Nathan and Grace exchanging a glance neither quite knew how to interpret, though something unspoken passed between them all the same. Nothing was decided that night, not officially. But something shifted quietly into place. An acknowledgement, unspoken but mutual, that whatever this was between them had grown into something worth exploring carefully, honestly in its own time. Grace walked home to the small guest cottage on the property that evening. Nathan had insisted months earlier that she and Caleb move into it rather than continuing the long commute from her old apartment, and stood for a long moment on the porch, looking up at the stars scattered across the clear spring sky. She thought of the woman who had stood on those front steps months earlier, humiliated in front of 200 strangers, accused of a crime she never committed, treated as disposable by someone who mistook wealth for worth. She thought of how far she'd traveled since that terrible night, not just in title or salary, but in something deeper, something that mattered more. She had been seen. Finally, completely seen. And she was only beginning to understand how much further that recognition would carry her. A year to the day after the engagement party that had shattered one future and quietly built another, Grace stood once again on the back lawn of the Sinclair estate. Though this time, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. There were no ice sculptures this time, no string quartets, no crowd of status-conscious strangers eager to be seen at the right event. Instead, there was a small gathering, close friends, a handful of Nathan's most trusted colleagues, Caleb in a neatly pressed suit he'd chosen himself, Lily in a simple white dress, practically vibrating with excitement she could barely contain. Nathan stood beneath the same ancient oak tree where, 1 year earlier, Vanessa Cole had pointed a cruel finger and demanded a humiliated woman empty her pockets in front of strangers. Now, that same spot held something entirely different. Nathan, waiting nervously, watching as Grace walked toward him in a simple, elegant dress, Caleb at her side, ready to walk her the final few steps. It hadn't been a whirlwind romance. It had been slow, careful, built over months of small kindnesses and honest conversations, tested by real life rather than manufactured for appearances. Nathan had proposed quietly, in the estate's library, no cameras, no audience, just the two of them and later, an ecstatic Lily who had declared she'd known it was coming for months. As Grace reached him beneath the oak tree, Nathan took her hands in his, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, just stood together, letting the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment settle quietly between them. "A year ago," Nathan said, his voice carrying just far enough for their small gathering to hear, "I stood in this exact spot and watched the worst version of what wealth and privilege can do to a person, cruelty dressed up as entitlement, humiliation treated as sport. I almost let it happen without stopping it. I've spent every day since trying to make sure I never make that mistake again." He looked at Grace, at Caleb standing proudly beside her, at Lily practically bursting with joy nearby. "What I've learned since then is that the people who matter most in this life are rarely the ones demanding attention. They're the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who show up every single day without asking for recognition, who build homes and raise children and hold entire families together through sheer strength of character. I spent 9 years not truly seeing the most important person in this house. I don't intend to spend another day making that mistake." Grace, tears falling freely now. Happy ones this time, the kind that came from a place of overwhelming gratitude rather than pain, squeezed his hands tightly. "I never imagined this," she admitted quietly. "Not in my wildest dreams. I thought that night would be the end of something, the end of my dignity, maybe, or the end of feeling safe in this house. I never imagined it would be the beginning of everything good that's happened since." Later that evening, as the small gathering shared a simple dinner beneath string lights strung between the oak trees, Grace found herself watching Caleb and Lily laughing together at the far end of the table. No longer employer's daughter and staff member's son, but simply family, bound together not by blood but by something equally strong. She thought about the woman who had stood humiliated on this very lawn 1 year earlier, tears streaming down her face while strangers pointed and laughed. She thought about how close that moment had come to breaking something essential in her. Her sense of worth, Her belief that hard work and quiet integrity mattered in a world that so often rewarded neither. But it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had revealed something she hadn't fully known about herself. A strength that had been there all along, simply waiting for the right moment, the right voice to bring it into the light. That voice had come from an unlikely place. A 6-year-old girl too honest and too brave to stay silent while injustice unfolded in front of her. Sometimes, Grace had come to understand, the truest measure of character isn't found in boardrooms or ballrooms, isn't measured in bank accounts or family names. It's found in small, quiet moments, in a child's refusal to let a lie stand, in a woman's refusal to let cruelty define her, in a man's willingness, however late, to finally see clearly what had been in front of him all along. Never let anyone's cruelty convince you that you're worth less than you are. Dignity isn't given by other people's approval. It's carried within you, even in your darkest, most humiliating moments. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly aren't the ones with power or status. Sometimes it's a child's honest heart. Sometimes it's simply time and truth, doing what they always eventually do. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to remember Grace. Remember that quiet strength always outlasts loud cruelty in the end. If you felt something watching this story unfold, please take a moment to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. If you're new here, consider subscribing because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that kindness and integrity always win in the end, please share this with them tonight. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.